Welcome to this session and greetings from the United States and the Czech Republic. My name is Arle Lommel. I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research. We'll say a bit more about our background shortly. My co-presenter, Katerina Gašová, is the Global Quality Director with Argos Multilingual. And today we'll be talking about a notion that many of you have heard about good enough translation and why maybe this isn't the best way to think about quality. And we'll also, the relevance of full of holes will become clear as we go on. As just a bit of background, as I mentioned, I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research. CSA Research is a market research firm that focuses on the global language industry, primarily focusing on requesters and providers of language services, but also on language technology, global consumers, and the education sector. Prior to joining CSA Research, and relevant for the presentation today, I worked at the Berlin-based Language Technology Lab of the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence, where I headed up development of what's now known as the multidimensional quality metrics, or MQM, that some of you may be familiar with. I've also worked for the Globalization and Localization Association, or GALA, and for many years for the Localization Industry Standards Association, or LISA, which has now been gone for 10 years. And Katka, if you'd like to say a few words about yourself.
Thank you, Arl, for your introductions. My honor, my pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm sitting in CT time zone, so it's almost evening here. A few words about myself. As you can see in the bio, I am industry veteran. My life has been connected with Moravia, a Czech-based or Brno-based localization agency, which grew over the years into one of the most important service providers, specifically for the big buyers and brands on the west coast of the US. I went through all of the long journey a translator might dream of. Started as a translator, and then I built my own team for Moravia of Czech linguists and continually grew the team of translators internationally and started working also with our supply chain vendor management to onboard a vast pool of talent mix that we worked with to deliver our projects into more than 150 languages to high-profile brands. Since 2005, I started building what was known as Moravia Linguistic Services, which is a quality department, or used to be a quality department at Moravia that implemented unique end-to-end quality management concepts and data-driven quality management. Then after Moravia having been acquired by RWS, I still continued working in this linguistic services department in its core and central structure to serve as a center of excellence for our translators, as well as a center of SME services for Moravia's clients and international buyers. In parallel to that, I was also collaborating similarly as Al with Gala organization and started delivering introductions into localization courses at the local university, Masaryk University, my alma mater in Brno, Czech Republic. Earlier this year, I changed the affiliation and currently I work for Argos Multilingual as stated in my bio. Once again, I'm honored to be with these audiences today.
Okay. Thank you, Katka. So today, as you saw, we're talking about the concept of good enough translation, and we're going to approach it in the following manner. First, we're going to talk about what is translation quality and how to define it. This is an issue that's long perplexed the industry and had many competing ideas. We're going to present one that we think is particularly useful. Then we'll be speaking about what is good enough translation, a concept that many people talk about but few people claim to be doing. After we've talked about it and why we see it as problematic, we'll talk about some of the alternatives to this approach. And then after looking at that and the way that technology influences this, we'll be talking about the role of human translators. And then talking briefly about how other language technologies beyond translation are affected by some of the ideas we've talked about before we go to closing thoughts. And with that, I'll start with talking about translation quality. And this is going to be the section where I explain why, despite saying something is full of holes usually is a negative thing, we actually mean it quite positively in this context. Some of you may be familiar with what's called the Swiss cheese model, which is a way of thinking about presenting disasters in which you erect multiple barriers, which are conceived of as being like pieces of cheese with holes in them. And you put them up between people and some negative outcome. And the idea is if something goes through one hole, that it's stopped at another layer. So you have multiple levels of trying to prevent problems. Today, I'm going to be talking about the reverse Swiss cheese model as a way to think about translation quality before we go into an actual definition. Think about this as being like people come, they speak different languages, they're interacting with an organization. In this case, I'll be talking about a typical e-commerce situation, but there's variations of this that work for almost any sort of organization. So in this view, we have 5 speakers of different languages, and they are looking to find a product that will improve their skin complexion, make them look better, hopefully help them find the love of their life, or do something wonderful. And so they start out, as we generally do, looking for something online. Now, if they're going to interact with a corporation that has something, they first need to find that it exists. And in this view, the first thing which we're conceiving of as a piece of Emmental cheese, that classic Swiss cheese with holes in it, the Albanian speaker doesn't find any Albanian content. And so the Albanian speaker's journey ends. He or she moves on to another company and doesn't find the product that this company offered that may have been beneficial. The others, however, find that there's some degree of language support in languages they understand, and they move on. This is the discovery phase in a typical customer journey, where someone first becomes aware that something exists. The second stage is browsing, and here we find that the Finnish speaker doesn't make it through because there's no real navigation in Finnish. The Finnish content is so limited that there's not a hole to get through this wall of English. The other speakers, however, make it through. There is Spanish, French, and German localization. And so they move on. At this browsing stage, you notice there's euro signs underneath these stage names, and they indicate the increasing value of contact that comes as people move through a customer journey. When you're starting out at the discovery phase, they may not have much value. You don't know if they're interested or not. But as they move further and further along, they become more valuable to an organization. The third layer here is evaluation. And in this case, the French speaker doesn't find enough information about the products to tell if she wants to buy them. But the Spanish and German speakers make it through. And now they've reached the point where they say, we feel like we want to buy this product. We're convinced it will make us look wonderful. It would improve our love life, make all the world a sunny day, to quote an old song. But what happens when there's no localized purchase experience? When the local currency isn't supported, for instance, in this case it probably is, but maybe the system can't accept a German address format, or there's something that's unclear in German. And so the German speaker says, well, I really wanted to buy this, I'm going to move off. And only the Spanish speaker has made it through the holes in each of these layers. And hopefully, after they've made the purchase, they find enough after-sales support and enough after-sales information that they can go on and become a loyal customer, someone who recommends the products and services to their friends. And in this case, they make it through. But there's, in this instance, the Spanish speaker is the only speaker of a non-English language that's made it through. Now, if you think about this, this provides a framework for thinking about how to deliver linguistic quality. If it enables people to accomplish what they want, if it fulfills a need, it works, it's quality. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. Okay. So this gets to the heart of translation quality. At the end of the day, if translation doesn't meet the needs of individuals, it closes off these holes. So let's think a little bit more about holes. Now, some of you probably look at the pair of jeans there with holes in it and think it's very fashionable. When I was younger, I would have been told to throw those pants away, but fashions change. But if we think about the holes in cheese, no translation is a wall of cheese that prevents somebody from reaching a goal. Poor translation that doesn't really meet their requirements is a small hole that they may not be able to pass through to get beyond. But good translation is a large hole in this model. It doesn't obstruct them, it allows them to move freely on towards their goal. And the purpose of localization of translation is to enable people to reach their goals and allow them queen through to the end of whatever it is they want to do. And depending on a particular product or service, different kinds of holes will work, other ones may not. So if there's something where a fast-moving consumer good, for instance, without a lot of text, we may not care that there aren't big holes. But if we're looking at investing money, or where romance is on the line, or any other thing that's deeply meaningful to us as humans, we want to find content in our own language. And this effect is significant. My company, CSA Research, has done an analysis of the buying behavior of over 9,000 global consumers in, I think we're up to 33 languages, including 5 variants of Spanish. And what we find consistently is that roughly 75% of consumers are unlikely to purchase items not in their language. They won't engage with brands that don't speak their language. In other words, in-language engagement is vital. And I should note that English knowledge actually doesn't mean that this factor decreases. Some groups of people with high English knowledge, such as Germans, are actually more reluctant to use English than those with lesser knowledge of English. And this is simply because they're used to having content in their language. And they expect it. And they know that they can go somewhere else and find it. So they may be able to eat that English cheese, but they don't want to. And think about your own experience. If you're looking for an item that you need, will you bother with a site in a language that you don't speak and where you may not even be able to identify the language? Will you continue in a site that is in some language that somehow resembles your native language, but it leaves you confused and unclear? Would you be comfortable interacting with an organization in a language that you learned in school many years ago, but you don't use on a daily basis? And would you trust a site with your money if you can't really be certain what you're committing to? These are some of the many reasons why people drop out of interacting with organizations. And for those who are involved with public administration, the situation is similar, even if it isn't about making a sale. When governments do not support the languages that their constituents understand or speak, they run the risk of excluding them from services and participation in the political process. In other words, providing translation that meets their requirements can become a matter of human rights. And with that, now let's talk about what makes a quality translation. We'll be presenting what's known as a functionalist definition here. And it has to be something that's more than some intangible feeling that says, well, I know a good translation when I see it. So we argue that a quality translation must always do 5 things. First, it must be accurate and fluent. This means it needs to say what the source says, and it needs to be readable. It needs to not confuse people. Now, what that actually means depends on the audience and purpose. So you have to know what is required to meet the needs of the audience and fulfill that purpose. Translating an academic treatise and translating the lyrics for a song will have very different requirements. A quality translation must also comply with all other specifications that have been negotiated between the requester and the provider. So if a requester says, we need this to fit in a certain length, or it needs to be in a certain format, or any of the many other things that you may say that you need, the provider has to be able to bring it back in that format. Otherwise, it's not a quality translation, no matter how good the language may be. And finally, the translation must meet end user needs. It's pointless to say you've done all these other things if at the end of the day it doesn't help someone do what they need to with the translation. So if a translation fails to meet any of these requirements, it cannot be considered a quality translation, no matter how good it may otherwise appear to be. Now, one question that we don't have a lot of time today to discuss is how you can actually measure whether a translation is a quality one. And I'm just throwing this in because it will be of interest to some of you. And if you have questions about this, feel free to reach out to me after this presentation. But broadly speaking, there are two approaches. The first is called holistic quality evaluation, and it focuses on the overall properties of translated content. Think of a questionnaire that says, could I read this and was it useful? That's measuring holistic quality. This approach is currently being developed within the ASTM F43 standards body. Now, the second approach is what I worked on developing. Multidimensional quality metrics exemplifies what's called analytic quality. And this is where you focus on identifying specific instances of errors. You generate a score, which hopefully represents how well the content meets user needs. MQM, which I developed, provides a listing of translation error types and allows implementers to create their own custom error metrics that they can use to evaluate translated content in light of their specifications. Because we can't discuss this more, if you're interested in this topic, I'd encourage you to visit themqm.org or again to reach out to me. Now, one important corollary of what we've said about translation quality is there's no such thing as the single perfect translation. Rather, there are a multitude, a myriad of possible perfect translations that vary depending on specifications and expectations. A quality translation for one context may be a poor quality one for another. And this now leads us to the discussion of what is good enough translation. Now, many of you, presumably if you're attending this session, have heard this term and may be skeptical of it. We hear this term a lot, and we usually hear it being used critically to refer to what someone else does. It's used to refer to a translation that is seen as bad, but that somehow just barely manages to achieve a particular desired outcome, such as helping someone solve a technical support problem. But this term is really used to express dissatisfaction with a translation, to say it is merely good enough for some purpose, but it isn't really good. So let's explore this a bit more. And I'll be turning this over to Katka in a bit to discuss some more of the history of this. But the first thing that we found when we were looking at the use of this term is that it's usually not defined precisely. It's defined in very vague terms. Something like saying, well, the translation must convey something adequately, but there's no explanation of what adequately means. And so this creates problems because it leaves it up to parties to say that they know it when they see it, but they may end up disagreeing on what exactly that means. As a result, good enough is not a good enough descriptor to be useful when we're talking about quality. Let's unpack this a little bit more. One criticism I frequently hear is that this represents an ISO 9000 perspective. Now, the ISO 9000 series of standards can be criticized on many grounds, and I think many of you have interacted with them and know that sometimes they have perverse incentives and they're overly formalistic. But ISO 9000 can't be blamed for this. It simply defines quality as something that meets requirements. And that doesn't tell us much about how to tell if something is good enough or not. So instead, when we look at what good enough means, we see two competing notions. One would be that it actually means the translation meets its requirements. And this is one thing that is probably good. We certainly wouldn't want a translation that doesn't. But most people actually use the term to refer to delivering translations that don't meet requirements. ones that leave no hole or a very small hole in those layers of cheese I discussed, translations that guarantee that people who do not speak English natively, and because we'll be honest, most of the time this is talking about commercial translation from English, it just ensures that they won't have a good experience, that they'll be left behind. So based on this, is good enough a useful concept? We argue that it isn't, and that without a translation brief or specifications, good enough is hopelessly vague. We need good specifications that account for stakeholder and end user requirements and ensure that something that is good enough according to them is in fact good enough. But if the specifications are missing or bad, you have no guarantee. And when somebody just says, I want a good enough translation, they're giving up on responsibility for specifications. So we say that good enough is a poor concept, but does anyone actually use it, and what do they mean by it if they actually are using it? And for this, I'm going to turn the time over to Katka to discuss the history of this and where it comes from.
In our preparatory talks with Arle, we started thinking, we started asking ourselves the question, so where actually does the good enough concept and term come from? And since you already know, I am an industry veteran. So looking backwards, I tried to remember when actually buyers started to question results and the data that they had been receiving from quality programs. Buyers had been paying for, because they were seeing greenish results or good results from language quality evaluations. On the contrary, they were exposed to a very negative feedback from their internal stakeholders, actually their first product users, on target content qualities. So with that, my thoughts brought me back to Microsoft. One of the most important customers of Moravia, were in 2007, they invited their service providers and introduced new perspective of language quality standards. In one of the opening statements, Microsoft said that by that point, they had researched new elements that substantially contributed to quality and to how quality was perceived by the user. And they had identified that those elements had not been considered in quality measurements before. On the other hand, Microsoft said there had been other elements evaluated, whereas the benefit from those other elements had been reported as very questionable. So with that, they decided to start looking into an element, an attribute that they named intelligibility. You see the definition coming from the Oxford English Dictionary back at a time, which was like the definition used by Microsoft for the element of intelligibility. Intelligibility was defined as the attribute, the element, which had not been considered any time before in their traditional quality evaluations and quality measurements. Yet there had been a general consensus that it is the backbone attribute without which none of the other attributes would matter, like looking into whether terminology is adhered to, whether which language is, what type of a language is used, whether there is a comma or not a comma, etc. So the newly introduced standards, which is on the next slide, were called premium, value, and basic. With the titles, you already see there is like no good enough label at all here. And the titles should somewhat indicate the differences between the quality expectations. All the individual standards were like the Microsoft's opportunity to address the different use cases of the content that had been produced back at the time, the different business value and importance of the content produced, and whether the content or the use case or which audiences and purposes the content had been intended to serve. So with that, Microsoft came to a conclusion that not all of the content needs to be of the same quality. Therefore, also they introduced three standards, three translation quality grades. Those standards were differentiated through error tolerance. They were thinking of where the error tolerance threshold is with the end user again. So the error tolerance for premium was much lower than the error tolerance for basic. Think again of the holes concept are introduced before. However, regardless of the error tolerances, there were three mandatory criteria that had always to be applied. Target content had to be intelligible. The degree of how much intelligible was illustrated very clearly using examples that showed the differences in how to assess such a subjective element like elements like clarity, comprehension, and readability. Parallel to this, obviously, there was no tolerance against or towards what they call country standards, which in our current terminology is local conventions and geopolitically sensitive concepts. And obviously, there was no tolerance for anything that might have been introduced by translators and might have caused build breaks or any functionality issues. So the definitions back at that time were seen quite weak. Still, it was a great attempt to show that quality can be differentiated and that it can be done through specifications. However, specifications needed to be fine-tuned through different pilots, feedback loops with Microsoft, and so on, up to today's use of or today's definitions of the quality standards applied for the localization of Microsoft's products. Next, after Microsoft, it was TAUS Translation Automation User Society, and the founder of TAUS, Jaap van der Meer, introduced the concept of diversified quality approach in the foundational report for dynamic quality framework known as DQF. The solution proposed by TAUS was a dynamic quality evaluation model that takes into account the challenging landscape of diversifications in content types and the adoption of automation technologies. So the underlying principle is linked to customer satisfaction and to specific use cases. TAUS was referring to quality levels, which were named premium, good enough, and fully automated. However, no specific definition of how to interpret the good enough label was provided back at that time. In any case, TAUS created the so-called DQF focus group, consisting of representatives of buyers and service providers, who then jointly agreed on the definitions of content types to at least help inspire buyers and service providers on how content type and use case differentiations might be done. So with that, what's the good enough concept today? Today, you know, all of us know that an unbelievable amount of content is created continuously. And content enablement is a big opportunity, but also a huge challenge. In many cases, it's not about the perfect translation, and I'll provide it illustrations of why nothing such as the perfect translation exists. Content enablement is about quality diversification. Our challenge consists in the fact that quality is open to interpretation. Again, we are repeating ourselves, but it's really very important to agree upon how to define what the expected result should look like and how to define it upfront. So when we talk about fit for purpose quality, we know today, we as the service providers, we know very well that this is kind of a buzzword, kind of a thing that is being asked in many calls for proposals by the buyers, because it's the underlying criterion for different types of service delivery criteria, such as the talent that should be engaged, who to assign the translation to, which workflows to use, which or how to scope quality evaluations done by humans, or how to define automated quality checks, and how to set up various relevant user feedback loops. Interestingly enough, from our experience, the good enough label does not appear as a truly used label by the buyers today. It's rather referred to as acceptable or standard quality designation. So we are facing a challenge that, as opposed to the easily definable premium quality requirement, which gives us already the notion that it should comply with all of the standardly or normally defined criteria, the definition of criteria for lower quality standards still represents a big challenge, both for the buyers and for the service providers. Generic specifications are not helpful. Generic specifications are very often open to subjectivity. A lot of space is given to subjectivity, and the final quality is not predictable. Unless they see it, buyers typically cannot imagine how different the target content will be from what they know as their premium standard. Unless clear instructions and guidance are given to translators are confused on what's still acceptable, specifically in regards to the adherence to existing client-specific terminology guidelines or general grammar and syntax rules. So ideally, several samples of target content are created to help fine-tune how to specify quality expectations for the given content, considering we are really not talking about top-notch, high visibility, high-profile content. So with that, it's really important to go into specifications. And here is like examples how specifications might evolve from something that is vague and generic to something that is more tangible in two cases. In one case where the client really counts every error, but the error tolerance is very high. And in the other case, it's like about looking into what really is important for comprehension and factual accuracy.
Okay, thank you, Katka. So with that, I think we see that where this concept of good enough came from. So let's look now at what are some of the alternatives. First off, what would an alternative be? If the alternative means not good enough, clearly that's not what we want. Nobody wants to waste money on something that isn't good. And in fact, quality is always required and expected. Otherwise, you're just wasting money. So I talked about specifications. Katka showed some examples, and if you look later, you can delve more into them. There's a lot there. But specifications define expectations, and all translations should meet expectations. So these need to be detailed and tied to metrics. And now this leads us to a notion that Katka mentioned of grades. We've been working lately on an issue of grades, which divides translation into 3 categories, which we call high, medium, and low. Now, these aren't value judgments about the content. Rather, they represent different sets of use cases. For example, if you're translating a legal contract, a high-grade translation would refer to the kind of translation you could submit to a court. A medium grade would be one that you could use internally for research in a law firm to understand what's going on, to prepare for a court appearance. And low grade would be something that has very low requirements, but is useful for saying, is this document even relevant to me? Each kind of document, each kind of use case would have different grades that would apply depending on what you're doing. And being able to differentiate between them based on precise criteria enables you to move beyond the vague notion of good enough to start talking about something with real meaning. Well, and I should have been going through these bullet points as going along. But grades provide a tool to start the discussion about quality expectations and to develop specifications. They aren't the end of it. And grades, therefore, are more specific than good enough. Now, some of you may say, well, this sounds like an excuse to use MT for a lot of things, to use machine translation, to exclude humans. And I can't say that's entirely wrong, because the vast majority of translation done today is low-grade translation, where there's little risk and people can use a machine translation system. Grades are independent of the method of production. We don't say that high grade must be produced by humans. And if tomorrow artificial superintelligence came out, we'd all be out of jobs and it would produce high grade translation. But as for now, unedited MT cannot reliably generate high grade translation. It simply cannot. And so anything where people need the certainty that comes from a translation with high quality requirements requires humans. High grade, therefore, requires human involvement. And increasingly, this is from augmented translation. Now, Katka is going to talk a little bit about whether translators should be lowering their standards in response to this.
So increasing number of translators really report a pressure on them to lower their standards. This is a natural consequence of the fact that buyers are often pressed by localization budget limitations. So as the result of the cost pressure, also buyers' impression is that just this kind of good enough quality will suffice. But we mentioned that before, that buyers typically do not have a clear understanding of how comprehensible good enough content should look like. So their expectations are rather based on anecdotal feedback or on some of perceptions, and specifically lack of clarity on tangible attributes of what constitutes lower quality content leads them to the incorrect interpretation that translators are asked to deliver crap or translate carelessly, as it's just perceived to be okay for the given situation. Lower quality does not mean that it's a sloppy translation or translation full of errors. It is a translation, on the contrary, that just may not call for top-notch formulation and appealing language or absolutely precise terminology, Yet the target content still must be factually correct and helpful to the user. And errors per se always affect users in a language experience, especially when a certain tolerance limit is exceeded. It means that the diversification in quality gives opportunities to translators who are maybe new, who are less experienced because the tolerance is higher. It's not saying that or expecting that somebody would lower the standard. Just on the contrary, it gives and offers opportunities, linguists and also paralinguists to grow, because it also offers opportunities to experts to be involved and to learn by doing things. So compensation models, buyers' budget limits, then of course impose challenges on who to engage. The 4 quality criteria are again the must-have starting point. And it's also about service providers working with the translators, being infrastructures and tools to engage, to communicate, to share, to provide feedback, and help translators understand what they are supposed to deliver for a certain lower grade translation.
Okay, thank you, Katka. So let's look a little bit more about the role of translators and how they can thrive when MT and artificial intelligence are becoming more common and taking away some of what they traditionally did. The role of translators is clearly changing rapidly. Gone are the days when you could just work with a text and ignore computers and all these things. So the challenge the industry faces today is how to balance the human and the machine. I mentioned briefly augmented translation, or what we call human at the core. This goes beyond traditional post-editing, which could be considered human in the loop, or as Slater recently called it, expert in the loop, in that it puts humans in the center and surrounds them with an array of technologies. I don't have time to go through them all today, but it allows humans to continue to operate because machines can't assure quality and can't replace humans, but it enables them to do more, and it moves professional linguists to the core of the production process rather than leaving them cleaning up garbage from MT. It allows technology to take away the 3 Ds, tasks that are dirty, dangerous, and cognitively difficult. Now you may say, how does that apply to translation? But I think of something like translating trivial variations of warning notices as something that is probably dangerous to my sanity. And it's certainly difficult sometimes to repeatedly do things that machines can easily do. And so it can free humans up to do more and to do more exciting things. Now, you may object and say, once we start taking away a lot of the work that you as translators do, what's going to be left? And you wouldn't be wrong in saying that it sounds like a lot of stuff will be taken away. But what remains is actually going to be bigger in volume than what you do today because of the increasing need for content. And it will increase the value of what translators do and make them more valuable. Just think, nobody complains that the airline pilots don't flap their arms to make the plane fly. Instead, they use technology to track and control systems that they could not hope to do without technology. And airline pilots are highly respected and skilled professionals. Similarly, translators will be able to do far more with technology and find that by eliminating all the repetitive, boring, and dirty and dangerous tasks that you might face will make you freer and more valuable and give you a more rewarding job. Now, we were asked to talk about other technologies. We don't have a lot of time to go into them. But MT is far from the only technology that will be affecting translators. It may be the furthest along, but we're seeing speech technologies catching up rapidly. The results are a bit more inconsistent and they're not available in all languages, but this is an area you need to be watching as language professionals and thinking about how you will interact with these and how quality will be affected by speech technologies. And we're seeing the convergence of speech and written technologies. And beyond this are a vast array of technologies such as quality estimation, entity recognition, intent recognition, and other items, but these all tend to be English only or limited to English, German, French, Spanish, and Chinese. Now, these technologies actually stand to benefit you, but they're taking some time to arrive fully. So in a sense, what we picture is a future in which linguists become cyborgs. Well, not literally, but you'll use an ever-improving array of assistive technologies to do your work. You will not be replaced by the machines, but instead you'll be using them to perform new and interesting tasks, tasks that today you may not even be able to dream of because the machines will enable them. And again, this is needed because of the vastly exploding amounts of content needed. At CSA Research, we did a thought experiment which said that if we were to translate, I think it was just something like 1/1,000,000th of all the content that's translated, it would take, unaided, the entire population of China, the European Union, and Indonesia to translate it, doing nothing else, focused on nothing else with no other economic output. So clearly that's not possible. We need to work with machines and deliver this. So for our closing thoughts, just a few things. One, avoid using the term good enough. It has too much baggage. It doesn't benefit anyone. Instead, focus on defining what quality means for the use cases that you work with and how you'll achieve quality. In some cases, MT may be great for that. It may be able to help you. In others, it may require pure human translation. And in many others, it will be a mix. Now, if we can traverse this change, the future is bright for translators and interpreters who can specialize and find ways to use machines to benefit themselves. So please, don't fear the machine. Machines are coming whether you want them to or not, and if you position yourself, they'll help you do far more than you can without them. And finally, if you want to achieve quality, make sure, and this is, I think, the biggest lesson here, clearly define expectations. And if you as a translator are given something with vague expectations, push back or at least document what you think you need to be doing so you can point to it if somebody says, well, I wanted this, not what you gave me. And again, remember that saying it's good enough isn't enough because you don't get guidance, but instead focus on good guidance, style sheets, terminology that's clear and actionable, and things where it's clear what's expected. And so I'll also note that this clarity will help prevent some of the bad actors who thrive on unclear pictures, ones who try and sometimes cheat translators of payment by claiming they did a bad job based on unclear expectations. Clarity will only benefit honest actors and help everyone. So to return to the question in the title of this presentation, we actually want something that's more than good enough. And we want an experience that is full of holes that allow people to progress to their goals regardless of the languages they speak, and ones which you as language professionals can help achieve and help make this world a better place. And with that, thank you, and it's time for questions.
Thank you, Arle. Thank you, Katka. That was really, really interesting. I think I am speaking for all the participants by saying that. So it's now time for question and answer. There is already a pretty interesting exchange in the chat. Not questions, but comments rather. I don't know if anybody would like to expand on that by taking the floor. Or you can choose to write your question directly in the chat or ask for the floor directly and ask your question to Arle or Katka.
If we're waiting, I'll just comment on the Molly Price's comment. She says it never been asked by a client or agency to provide a good enough or just translation. And so she's always assumed that high quality is required and have delivered that. I think that is the default assumption for language professionals. And a lot of the low-grade translation is just shunted off as Irene comments to DeepL or something else. But there has been a real sense in the industry and the research that CSA Research has done that a lot of linguists feel that they're being asked to compromise their quality values. And so I think having this discussion about grades and ways of thinking about quality can help push back or help them see that in some cases, maybe what's needed is a medium grade thing. And if they don't want to do that, that's fine. But this diversification will help, I think, everyone get what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. I see a very interesting question from a perspective of a service provider. There is a question, is educating the client an option? Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. It always pays off. It only depends on how open, how mature the client is. And also, first, before any discussion with the client is started, every service provider should put themselves into the shoes of the client first, should understand what is behind client's needs or why the client raises, say, requirements the way they do. But then, obviously, it makes sense to come up with examples. It's not about pushing back. It's about trying to understand clients' needs, clients' painful points, and then coming up with solid examples and expectations. And my experience is having worked really with many high-profile clients and discussing quality. Basically, it is about a discussion, and I have never experienced a pushback from client side when solid information was provided and the client could see, like, we're looking at the challenges from their perspectives, through their optic. If then you need or you're interested in such a discussion, feel free to ping me either here or via LinkedIn and we can continue this. But I definitely recommend it. Collaboration and communication is the key to success here.
I'll note one of the other comments here that I thought was, I think, insightful to one of the difficulties that the industry faces, and that's Linda Gunnarson's comment. The trend so far seems rather to be that humans in the loop are less valued. In my opinion, MT is used to pressure rates lower than what is reasonable. And I can't say that Linda's wrong. That has been the way it has gone, particularly with post-editing, where rates are typically about 65% to 70% of regular human translation, and often it takes more effort. But if you notice, what I showed was not post-editing. It was a different approach in which these technologies assist the human, but the human's in charge. They aren't cleaning up MT scut and junk. And one of the key technologies that is developing is what's called quality estimation, which will be able to take some of the bad MT and say, we're not even going to show this to the translator. It's not worth them spending time. So technology at once is putting negative pressure on translators. It's absolutely true. But we're starting to see the emergence of a framework that will improve things. I hope that, Linda, I may not have convinced you, but I think your comment was very apt, and hopefully you see that maybe there's some hope for technology.
I see another interesting question. How much is the client willing to pay? How long is the client willing to wait for the translation? And quality is usually compromised by these questions. So how much is the client willing to pay? This is exactly what I was talking about when I mentioned, like, service delivery levels. So basically, it needs to be clarified. It's about a discussion with the client, because price pressure, budget costs, it always is there. And as long as clients really don't have a clear understanding and don't see what they are getting, then it is a problem, because first, again, education is a must. So typically, if there is a pressure on rates, on compensations, then again, specification has to mention what they will be getting for the money they are paying. Some clients are okay with engaging, say, low mature resources, paraprofessionals, because the translation, the purpose is different than it's for the high profile translation. If it comes to turnaround times and speed, of course, then again, I believe clients clearly define their expectations, and it goes hand in hand with price negotiations. High profile translations might be requested at a very quick turnaround time in case that there is really a true guarantee on who is engaged and how much they pay for this. However, lower profile translations, they can be delivered very quickly, but again, there must be a clear definition of what is a tolerated error threshold, for instance, or what matters most for a client. All of that is typically subject, again, in my experience, in the discussions with the clients before, say, the first project it started. And some clients are really open even to go for pilots, see several different options, what they will be getting for the money, and then they are given an option to make a choice. And with that, there is enough clarity. And I think it's also important to think of the whole like delivery chain. So for MLVs, buyers are the buyers, but MLVs are the buyers of, say, freelancers or LSPs, and the same level of transparency must be observed there as well. No difference.
If I could add to what you said, Katka, thinking about the issue willing to pay, that's where grades can also help. So to Jesus's comment, if somebody comes and says, well, I need this translation tomorrow and I'm willing to pay you 5 cents a word, that's when you can push back and say, yeah, well, it can be done, but you're going to get a low grade translation because what you've asked for to get a high grade translation is impossible. And pointing to standard grade definitions, which when they come out, they're in the standardization process now with ISO and ASTM, will help you push back at some of the unrealistic and frankly at times stupid requests that may come in. Okay. I see some other comments. Do we have any other questions?
I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't know if everybody would like to take the floor, otherwise we can start wrapping up the session, if you agree.
Yeah, so I think if you have questions, I realize I didn't put my email address on the closing slide, but you can reach out to me via LinkedIn, or you can find Katka on LinkedIn to continue the discussion if you so desire.
Thank you very much. And please remember to access the Slido poll before leaving, please. There is a question ongoing on what is the main takeaways of this session for you. We would really appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And have a nice evening in Brussels and nice day or evening wherever you are located then.
Yes. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a nice evening.